face of conventional wisdom can be summed up in a pretty simple phrase. And this is it. Kids do well if they can, which has become the guiding philosophy of our work, the foundation of our work. And when you look at it up here, you probably say to yourself, what's so earth-shattering about that? And on its own, it may not seem particularly earth-shattering, but it actually is, and I want to explain why. See, what kids do well if they can suggests is that if a kid could do well, he would do well. If she could do well, she would do well. And if she's not doing well, something must be standing in her way. And if something's standing in her way, then we all, as the helpers in her life, we need to figure out what's standing in her way so we can help. And I'm sure that sounds like perfect common sense to everybody, because it is. And yet, it flies in the face of conventional wisdom, because the more conventional way of thinking when it comes to challenging behavior is not kids do well if they can. It sounds a lot more like kids do well if they want to. And you see, if you believe kids do well if they want to and a kid's not doing well, so for instance, they're not behaving well, you believe kids do well if they want to, they're not behaving well, then you're going to assume the reason he's not behaving well is because he doesn't want to. And if he doesn't want to, then what's all of our jobs? To try to make him want to do well. And while that probably seems like a very narrow, unpleasant, probably pretty ineffective role to play in the lives of these kids, the interesting thing about it is when you think about traditional discipline in our homes, traditional school discipline, discipline in society, it is all oriented around trying to make kids want to do well. Rewards, punishments, timeouts, detention, suspensions, expulsions, you name it, they are all aimed at trying to motivate people to do better, safe in the assumption that they're not doing well because they don't want to. Well, you know what? I don't buy it. What I've learned is it doesn't make any sense. What I've learned is kids do well if they can. I believe kids do well if they can. I believe if a kid could do well, he would do well. And if he's not doing well, you know what? Something has got to be standing in his way, and it cannot be as simple as he just doesn't want to. I also believe that it's high time we learn from more than 50 years of research in the neurosciences that has shown beyond the shadow of a doubt that conventional wisdom is wrong. Now, there are countless examples in our history of where conventional wisdom sticks around a lot longer after it's been disproven. You can go back to something like the world is flat. Well, you know what? We learned it was round, but nobody wanted to part with the idea that it was flat. I think we're going to find the same thing about the notion that kids do well if they want to. All of the research in the neurosciences for the past 50 years has shown beyond the shadow of a doubt that challenging kids do not lack the will to behave well, they lack the skills to behave well. Skills to behave well, what kind of skills am I talking about? I'm talking about skills like problem solving, like flexibility, like frustration tolerance. In other words, what all the research in the neurosciences has shown us is that kids who exhibit chronic challenging behavior, you know what? They have like a learning disability, except instead of areas like reading, math, and writing, this learning disability is in areas like problem solving, flexibility, frustration tolerance. I think it's actually a very accurate, apt, and powerful analogy. And here's why. I'm in my mid-40s. If we went back to when I was in elementary school, actually not far from here, if there was a child who was reading several grade levels behind his peers, back then, well-meaning, empathic, caring educators would not have said to themselves, I wonder if he has a learning disability. I wonder if he's got dyslexia. I wonder if he has a hard time phonetically decoding words. No, actually 40 years ago, those folks would have said, I wonder if he is either dumb or lazy. And I know that there are people sitting here listening right now who can attest to the personal pain of that, to being the child in the classroom who ironically was trying harder than anybody else in that classroom to read and was completely misunderstood. You know what's interesting about that? Guess who wasn't trying very hard in that classroom to read? The students to whom it came naturally. Guess who was trying harder than anybody else? The very kids that we used to think were lazy. What a terrible shame. Thank goodness we have come a long way since then, but not when it comes to kids with challenging behavior. Here's a little bit of a news flash. You know those good kids, those kids we say, they're so compliant, they do what we want, they're such good kids. You know what? They get so many kudos for their great behavior, and they don't even deserve them. You know why they don't deserve them? Because they're not even trying very hard. It just comes naturally to them. Guess who's trying inordinately hard to behave themselves during the course of the day? The very kids we're trying to motivate to behave better. A very wise man who has taught me a lot in his lifetime. He's in his 98th year now, my grandfather. He's taught me a lot. One of the things he taught me early on is he said, when you give a dog a name, eventually they will answer to it. And I have learned that if you treat kids like they are lazy, unmotivated, don't care, aren't trying hard enough, over time, don't be surprised when they start to look like, talk like, and act like they don't care and aren't trying hard enough. And you know what? I don't believe it. I believe kids do well if they can. I have yet to meet the kid that prefers doing poorly to doing well. I believe kids do well if they can. Now, there may be some of you listening here who have 2-year-olds. 2-year-olds are particularly poorly behaved. Now, is that because they're evil beings? No. Might feel that way, but why are 2-year-olds so poorly behaved? Do you know why? Because they stink at being flexible, they have horrible frustration tolerance, and extremely limited problem-solving skills. But we don't get too concerned because they're 2. And the good news is, when a lot of them get to be 4 and 6 and 8 and 10 and 12, etc., they get better at all that stuff. But some don't. And this is the interesting thing. Development happens at different rates. So many of the kids I've worked with have incredible gifts where development has gone way ahead very quickly. But in the areas of problem solving, flexibility, and frustration tolerance, they may be delayed relative to their peers. And I can tell you something, that when adults shift their thinking from kids do well if they want to kids do well if they can, amazing things happen. Amazing things happen. When you put yourself in the position of trying to figure out what a kid is struggling with and how you can help, as opposed to how you can try to get them to try harder to behave themselves well, amazing things happen. Now, here's the interesting thing about this learning disability of sorts that I'm referring to. It's different in the sense that, you know what? You can't set a kid up with a tutor to fix this kind of learning disability. An alternative reading program is going to help somebody who has a hard time phonetically decoding words. But you know what? Skills like problem solving, flexibility, frustration tolerance, those actually need to be taught in the actual situations when you need to use them. In other words, you have to actually have situations where those neural networks in the brain are activated to practice those very skills.